Men, the most dangerous attacks during arguments aren't the obvious insults. They're the psychological tactics disguised as valid criticisms that systematically erode your self-worth and position in the relationship. Today, we're breaking down 6 specific things women say during fights that reveal they're deliberately trying to lower your value. Before we dive in, hit subscribe, smash that like and hype button, and drop a comment if you've ever heard any of these phrases, and later realized they were manipulation designed to make you feel inadequate. Your awareness might help another man recognize the value reduction tactics before he accepts a diminished position in his relationship. Statement 1. You're just like every other guy. Stripping your individuality. When she says this during a fight, she's not making an observation about common male behavior. She's executing a sophisticated value reduction tactic that strips away your individuality and reduces you to a generic, replaceable member of a category she's defining as fundamentally flawed and inferior. What this statement actually does: this phrase attacks your uniqueness and special status in her life. One of the fundamental human needs is to be seen as an individual with distinct qualities, not as interchangeable member of a category. By claiming you're just like every other guy, she's saying there's nothing special about you, nothing that makes you different from any random man she could replace you with tomorrow. This creates immediate anxiety about your replaceability and lowers your perceived value in the relationship. Notice how this statement groups you with every other guy, while implying that entire category is negative. She's not saying you're like most guys in a neutral or positive way. She's using this comparison to suggest that being male itself is a deficiency, and you're failing to overcome the inherent inadequacy of your gender. This creates an impossible standard where you're guilty by association with your entire gender. Pay attention to when she deploys this phrase. It usually comes after you've expressed a need, set a boundary, or called out her behavior. If you ask for respect, suddenly you're just like every other guy who can't handle a strong woman. If you express hurt about something she did, you're just like every other guy who's too sensitive. The phrase reframes your legitimate concerns as gender-typical weakness rather than valid relationship issues. She's creating a framework where anything masculine about you, your communication style, emotional processing, approach to problems, is automatically inferior to her way of doing things. This isn't about you having actual problematic behavior. It's about making maleness itself the problem, so that you're always starting from a position of deficiency that needs to be overcome. Watch how this statement makes you feel compelled to prove you're different. That's exactly the response she's manipulating you toward. Once you're trying to prove you're not like other guys, you've accepted her premise that other guys are bad, and that you need her validation to confirm you've transcended your gender's inherent inadequacy. This gives her power to grant or withhold that validation based on your compliance with her demands. Notice that she never has to specify what every other guy does or why it's wrong. The vagueness is intentional because it allows her to apply this criticism to virtually any behavior she wants to control. Whatever you do that she doesn't like can be dismissed as typical guy behavior without her having to make actual argument for why it's problematic. She's also creating comparison anxiety. By invoking every other guy, she's implicitly threatening that you're in competition with a vast pool of men who could replace you. This activates your fear of losing her to someone better and makes you more willing to accept criticism and lower status to avoid being discarded for someone who meets her standards more completely. The psychological mechanism. This statement works by attacking your sense of individual value and creating categorical guilt. Instead of addressing specific behaviors in specific contexts, she's making your gender identity itself the problem. This is psychologically devastating because you can't change being male, which means you're permanently starting from a position of inadequacy in her framework. The only way to gain value is through her validation that you've sufficiently distinguished yourself from your inherently flawed category. Validation she controls and can revoke at any moment. How to recognize and respond. When you hear, "You're just like every other guy," recognize it as a value reduction tactic, not valid criticism. Refuse to defend yourself against categorical accusations. Respond with, "I'm not interested in defending myself against vague comparisons to hypothetical other men. If you have a specific issue with something I actually did, We can discuss that. Otherwise, this conversation isn't productive. By refusing to accept the premise that you need to prove your differentiation from other men, you maintain your value and force her to make actual specific criticisms rather than categorical attacks. If she can't or won't specify actual problems, you've exposed that this was about lowering your value, not about resolving legitimate issues. Statement 2. My ex would never. Installing comparison anxiety. When she brings up her ex during arguments, especially to highlight how he supposedly outperformed you in some area, she's not accidentally making a thoughtless comparison. She's deliberately installing comparison anxiety that lowers your value by positioning you as inferior to a predecessor who set standards you're failing to meet. What this statement actually does: this phrase creates direct value comparison where you're on the losing end. By invoking her ex as the superior standard, she's telling you that you're not measuring up to someone she already discarded. This is psychologically brutal because it means even a relationship that failed produced a better partner than you in at least some areas. You're being compared unfavorably to someone who wasn't good enough to keep, which places you even lower on the value hierarchy. Notice the strategic use of never in this construction. My ex would never forget our anniversary, or my ex would never speak to me like that. The absolute language suggests her ex was perfect in this dimension, which is almost certainly false. She's romanticizing past relationship to make you look worse by comparison. This rewriting of history serves the purpose of lowering your current value rather than reflecting actual past reality. Pay attention to which areas she chooses for these comparisons. They're always domains where you've just demonstrated some imperfection or where you differ from her preferences. If you're not as financially generous as she wants, suddenly her ex would never hesitate to spend money on her. If you set a boundary she doesn't like, her ex would never be so controlling. The comparison is targeted to make you insecure about the specific thing she wants to change about you. She's creating triangulation where you're in competition with a ghost. You can't defend yourself against these comparisons because you don't know what her ex actually did or didn't do, and she controls the narrative. You're competing against her idealized memory or complete fabrication, which means you're competing in a rigged game where she moves the goalposts to ensure you always fall short. Watch how this statement makes you want to prove you're better than her ex. That's the manipulation working. Once you're trying to outperform her previous partner, you've accepted that your value is determined by comparison to other men rather than being inherent. This gives her power to constantly move the standard and keep you performing for her validation. Notice that bringing up exes during arguments is inherently disrespectful to current relationship. Healthy partners don't weaponize past relationships to criticize current partners. The fact that she's willing to use this tactic reveals that she's more interested in controlling you through insecurity than in resolving conflicts constructively. She's also subtly threatening you with replacement. By highlighting how great her ex was in certain areas, she's implying she could return to him or find someone else who combines your positive qualities with his. This activates your fear of abandonment and makes you more compliant to avoid being discarded for someone better. The psychological mechanism. This statement works by creating competitive anxiety against an idealized comparison point you can't actually compete against. She controls both sides of the comparison. She defines what her ex was like, and she judges whether you measure up. This rigged comparison system ensures you're always inadequate in some dimension, which keeps you insecure and seeking her validation. The goal is making you believe your value is conditional on outperforming other men rather than being inherent, which gives her power to grant or withhold value judgments based on your compliance. How to recognize and respond. When you hear comparisons to her ex, recognize it as deliberate value reduction through triangulation. Refuse to compete with her past relationships. Respond with, I'm not interested in competing with your ex. If you think he was better for you, you're free to pursue that. If you're with me, then I expect to be evaluated on my own merits in our relationship, not constantly compared to your past. Bringing up exes during arguments is disrespectful, and I won't accept it. This response reasserts your value as inherent rather than comparative, refuses to play the competition game, and establishes that weaponizing past relationships is unacceptable behavior that you won't tolerate. Statement 3. You're too sensitive. Invalidating your legitimate feelings. When she dismisses your emotional responses by calling you too sensitive, she's not offering helpful feedback about emotional regulation. She's executing a value reduction tactic that invalidates your legitimate feelings, reframes your boundaries as weaknesses, and establishes that your emotional reality doesn't matter as much as her freedom to act without consequences. What this statement actually does: this phrase attacks your emotional validity and masculinity simultaneously. By labeling you as too sensitive, she's suggesting that your feelings are excessive, unreasonable, and constitute a personal failing. This makes you question whether your emotional responses are legitimate or whether you're overreacting, which is exactly the self-doubt she's trying to install to prevent you from holding her accountable. Notice that too sensitive is almost always deployed in response to you expressing hurt, disappointment, or boundaries about her behavior. You're not too sensitive when you're happy or agreeable. You only become too sensitive when your emotional responses inconvenience her or require her to change her behavior. This reveals that the criticism isn't about your actual emotional regulation. It's about silencing responses that might hold her accountable. Pay attention to the implicit standard this statement creates. If you're too sensitive, then there must be a correct amount of sensitivity, and she's positioning herself as the authority who determines what that amount is. This gives her power to invalidate any emotional response that doesn't serve her interests by simply labeling it as excessive. Your feelings become legitimate only when she validates them, which strips you of emotional authority in your own life. She's also attacking your masculinity through this phrase. Too sensitive carries connotations of weakness and femininity in cultural contexts that still associate emotional expression with female characteristics. By calling you too sensitive, she's implying you're not masculine enough to handle normal relationship dynamics without getting your feelings hurt. This creates shame around emotional honesty and pushes you toward suppressing feelings to prove your masculinity. Watch how this statement makes you question your own perceptions. That's gaslighting in action. When someone repeatedly tells you that your emotional responses are excessive, you start doubting whether your feelings are valid. This self-doubt is exactly what she wants, because it means you'll stop expressing concerns about her behavior and stop enforcing boundaries that limit what she can do without consequences. Notice that she never acknowledges her role in creating the feelings she's dismissing. If she hurt you and you express that hurt, a caring partner would acknowledge their impact and work toward repair. Instead, she's making your hurt the problem rather than her hurtful behavior. This reversal ensures she never has to take accountability for how her actions affect you. She's establishing a dynamic where expressing negative emotions about her behavior will be met with invalidation and criticism rather than care and repair. This trains you to suppress your feelings to avoid being labeled as too sensitive, which allows her to behave however she wants, without emotional consequences or accountability. The psychological mechanism. This statement works by making your emotional responses themselves the problem, rather than the behaviors that cause those responses. By framing your sensitivity as excessive, she avoids addressing her own behavior while making you feel defective for having natural emotional reactions. This creates a relationship dynamic where she has freedom to act without emotional accountability, because expressing hurt about her actions will be dismissed as your oversensitivity rather than her problematic behavior. Your value is lowered because your emotional reality is defined as less legitimate than her behavioral freedom. How to recognize and respond. When you hear you're too sensitive, recognize it as invalidation tactic designed to avoid accountability. Refuse to defend your emotional legitimacy. Respond with, "My feelings are my reality, and I don't need you to validate them as reasonable. Whether you think I'm too sensitive is irrelevant. What matters is that my feelings exist and I'm communicating them to you. If you're not willing to acknowledge how your behavior affects me, that tells me a lot about whether you actually care about my emotional experience in this relationship." This response reasserts your emotional authority, refuses the trap of defending your sensitivity, and puts focus back on her behavior and willingness to care about your experience rather than dismissing it. Statement 4. You're not man enough. Direct masculinity attack. When she questions your manhood during arguments, she's not expressing legitimate concern about gender role performance. She's launching a nuclear assault on your core identity that strikes at fundamental masculine insecurity to lower your value and force compliance through shame about failing to meet arbitrary masculinity standards. What this statement actually does. This phrase attacks your gender identity at its foundation. For most men, being seen as adequately masculine is tied to self-worth, social status, and identity security. By directly questioning whether you're man enough, she's activating the deepest masculine insecurities. Fears that you're weak, inadequate, less than other men, failing at the fundamental task of being male. This creates overwhelming pressure to prove your masculinity by complying with whatever she's demanding. Notice that man enough is never clearly defined. What makes someone man enough? The vagueness is strategic because it allows her to apply this criticism to whatever behavior she wants to control. You're not man enough if you express emotions, set boundaries, prioritize your needs, decline her demands, or basically anything that doesn't serve her interests. The undefined standard means she controls what counts as sufficiently masculine, which gives her power to perpetually judge you as falling short. Pay attention to when this weapon is deployed. It usually comes when you've resisted something she wants, or enforced a boundary she doesn't like. If you won't give her money, you're not man enough to provide. If you express hurt, you're not man enough to handle conflict. If you set boundaries about her behavior, you're not man enough to handle a strong woman. The phrase reframes your reasonable actions as masculine failures that require you to prove your manhood through compliance. She's using cultural baggage about masculinity as a weapon against you. Society already places enormous pressure on men to perform masculinity in specific ways, and she's exploiting those pressures to control you. By threatening your masculine status, she's activating not just her judgment, but your fear of judgment from other men, society, and yourself about whether you're adequately male. Watch how this statement creates impossible binds. If you comply with her demands to prove you're man enough, you're allowing her to define your masculinity and control you through shame. If you resist and maintain your boundaries, she's successfully planted doubt about your masculine adequacy that will eat at you even if you don't show it. Either way, she's lowered your value by making your gender identity contingent on her validation. Notice that this is a form of intimate partner abuse. Using someone's core identity against them as a weapon during conflicts is emotionally abusive behavior designed to control through shame and fear. The fact that she's willing to attack your fundamental sense of self reveals she's more invested in control than in healthy partnership. She's also comparing you to other men and finding you lacking. Not man enough implies there are other men who are man enough. Men who would give her what she wants, tolerate what she does, perform as she demands. This comparison lowers your value by suggesting you're falling short of standards that better men easily meet. The psychological mechanism. This statement works by weaponizing masculine insecurity and cultural gender expectations. Most men have been socialized to prove their masculinity and fear being seen as inadequate men. By directly attacking your manhood, she's activating the deepest insecurities and pressures you face as a male, then offering compliance with her demands as the path to redeeming your masculine status. This gives her enormous power because she's positioned herself as the validator of your core identity. You're only adequately masculine when she says you are, which means you have to keep proving it by meeting her standards. How to recognize and respond. When you hear you're not man enough, recognize it as abusive manipulation through identity attack. Refuse to prove your masculinity on her terms. Respond with, I don't need you to validate my masculinity. I define what being a man means for me, not you. Using my gender against me as a weapon during arguments is manipulative and abusive, and it tells me you're more interested in control than respect. I won't be shamed into compliance, and if you can't engage with me respectfully, we're done with this conversation. This response reclaims your masculine identity as self-defined rather than requiring her validation, names her tactic as abusive, and establishes that you won't be controlled through shame about gender adequacy. Statement 5. Everyone thinks you're recruiting phantom social pressure. When she claims that everyone shares her negative opinion of you, She's not reporting consensus from your social circle. She's manufacturing phantom social pressure by pretending that your friends, family, and broader community agree with her criticism, which isolates you and lowers your value by suggesting everyone sees the inadequacies she's highlighting. What this statement actually does: this phrase creates the illusion of consensus against you. Instead of this being just her opinion that you can potentially dismiss or disagree with, she's claiming that everyone important in your life secretly agrees with her negative assessment. This transforms a one-on-one disagreement into you against the world, which is psychologically isolating and makes her criticism seem more legitimate because it's supposedly validated by collective judgment. Notice that she never provides specifics about who everyone is or what they actually said. The vagueness protects her lie because you can't verify or challenge claims that remain abstract. If she said, "Your brother thinks you're controlling," you could ask your brother directly. By keeping it at "everyone thinks," she maintains the pressure without having to provide evidence that could disprove her manipulation. Pay attention to what everyone thinks about you. It's always something that aligns with her current criticism. If she's calling you cheap, suddenly, everyone thinks you're stingy with money. If she's calling you controlling, everyone thinks you're possessive. The phantom consensus miraculously always supports whatever she wants you to feel bad about in this specific argument, which reveals this is manufactured pressure rather than reported reality. She's using your relationships against you as weapons. By invoking your friends and family as secret critics, she's poisoning your trust in those relationships and creating paranoia about whether people actually think badly of you behind your back. This isolation makes you more dependent on her, because if everyone else secretly judges you negatively, she's the only one who accepts you despite your flaws. Watch how this statement makes you feel defensive and desperate to prove the phantom critics wrong. That's the manipulation working. Once you're worried about what everyone thinks, you're no longer focused on whether her criticism is valid or whether her behavior in the argument is acceptable. You're distracted by concern about your social reputation and trying to defend yourself against accusations from people who may not have made them. Notice how this tactic prevents you from getting outside perspective. If you believe everyone already thinks negatively of you, you're less likely to talk to friends or family about relationship problems because you're afraid they'll confirm the criticism. This keeps you isolated in her narrative without access to reality checks from people who might tell you her behavior is actually the problem. She's also lowering your value by suggesting your inadequacies are obvious to everyone, not just her. If she were the only one who saw these problems, you could dismiss her as having unique standards or wrong perceptions. But if everyone sees these flaws, then they must be real and significant, which confirms you're as inadequate as she's claiming. The psychological mechanism. This statement works by creating phantom social pressure that makes her individual criticism seem like collective consensus. Humans are deeply affected by perceived social judgment, and the belief that everyone thinks poorly of you creates shame, defensiveness, and desperate efforts to repair your reputation. By manufacturing this consensus, she amplifies the impact of her criticism far beyond what her individual opinion could achieve, and she isolates you from support systems that might provide reality checks about her manipulative behavior. How to recognize and respond. When you hear "everyone thinks you're," recognize it as manipulation through phantom social pressure. Call out the vagueness and demand specifics. Respond with, "Who specifically said that? Give me names and what they actually said, because I'll be asking them directly." If you can't provide specifics, then you're making up phantom criticism to manipulate me, which is dishonest and manipulative. My friends and family can speak for themselves, and using them as weapons without their knowledge is disrespectful to everyone involved. This response calls her bluff, demands accountability for her claims, and signals you'll verify her story, which exposes the manipulation if she's lying. If she's actually telling the truth, you deserve to know who's criticizing you so you can address it directly. Statement 6. I can do so much better than you. Threatening replacement. When she says she could do better than you during an argument, she's not expressing momentary frustration or making an emotional outburst. She's deliberately threatening you with replacement to lower your value and create fear that you need to improve your behavior. or lose her to someone superior who's waiting to take your place. What this statement actually does. This phrase directly attacks your relationship value and security. By stating she can do better, she's saying you're inadequate compared to other options available to her. This creates immediate anxiety about your replaceability and forces you into competition with hypothetical other men who supposedly exceed you in the areas where you're falling short of her standards. Notice how this statement positions her as the prize and you as the lucky recipient of her attention, despite your inadequacy. She's not saying the relationship isn't working for both of you or that you're incompatible. She's specifically saying she could upgrade from you. This framing makes the relationship fundamentally unequal, where she's settling for less than she deserves by being with you, and you should be grateful she hasn't traded up yet. Pay attention to when this threat is deployed. It usually comes when you've challenged her behavior, set a boundary she doesn't like, or failed to meet some demand. If you won't tolerate disrespect, suddenly she can do better than someone who's so demanding. If you express needs, she can do better than someone who's so needy. The threat reframes your reasonable expectations as burdens that better men wouldn't impose on her. She's creating constant relationship insecurity. If she can do better and might leave at any moment, you're living under threat of abandonment that motivates you to accept treatment you otherwise wouldn't tolerate. The fear of losing her to someone better makes you more willing to compromise your boundaries, suppress your needs, and tolerate problematic behavior to avoid being replaced. Watch how this statement forces you to prove your value to retain her. That's exactly the power dynamic she's creating. Once you're performing to prove you're good enough to keep, you've accepted that your value is conditional on meeting her standards rather than being inherent. This gives her power to keep raising standards and ensuring you're always falling slightly short, always needing to do more to be worthy of her. Notice that threatening to leave during arguments is a form of relationship terrorism. Using the threat of abandonment to control partner behavior is emotionally abusive because it leverages your attachment and fear of loss to force compliance. Healthy partners don't threaten the relationship's existence every time they're unhappy about something. She's also revealing fundamental disrespect. If she genuinely believed she could do better, she would leave rather than staying while reminding you of your inadequacy. The fact that she stays while threatening to leave suggests this is about control rather than actual dissatisfaction. She wants the power that comes from you, believing she's settling for you while having superior options available. The psychological mechanism. This statement works by activating abandonment anxiety and creating competitive pressure against phantom superior alternatives. By threatening replacement, she makes the relationship feel constantly precarious, which motivates you to accept lower status and poor treatment to avoid being discarded. You become focused on proving your worth rather than evaluating whether she's actually a good partner, which keeps you in a one-down position where you're always the inadequate one trying to measure up rather than an equal partner who deserves respect. How to recognize and respond. When you hear, "I can do better than you," recognize it as value reduction through replacement threat. Refuse to beg or compete for her. Respond with, "If you genuinely believe you can do better, then do it. I'm not going to perform to prove I'm worthy of being with someone who thinks I'm inadequate. Either you want to be with me and treat me with respect, or you pursue whatever better option you think exists. But I won't stay in a relationship where I'm constantly threatened with replacement for not meeting impossible standards." This response calls her bluff, refuses to compete, and makes clear you won't tolerate relationship terrorism. If she actually leaves, she's revealed she never valued you anyway. If she backs down, you've established that replacement threats won't work to control you.